say dogs can sense things, storms, earthquakes, emotions, even death. But nothing could prepare the small town of Elmwood for the story that unfolded inside room 306 of the Willow Haven Hospice, where a frail man named Thomas Everly lay tangled in a final sleep, his breath shallow, his skin pale, and beside him, nestled faithfully and unmoving for over 4 days now, sat his old golden retriever, Max, whose amber eyes never blinked for long, and whose head rested beside Thomas's motionless hand, as though guarding him from time itself. And while nurses whispered in hushed tones and visitors stopped to peek through the half-closed door, none could fully understand the weight of what kept that dog from budging, from eating, from even relieving himself, save for short walks taken under protest, dragging his paws and returning like gravity pulled his heart back into the room, because this wasn't just loyalty, it was something deeper, something unspoken, carved from years of silent companionship that had begun long before Thomas had taken this final bed, long before his hands shook from age and his voice quivered with memory, and even before the cancer diagnosis had unraveled his strength like threads from a worn shirt. No, this story began 20 years ago on a rain-slick street when a 37-year-old Thomas, a quiet school librarian with a soft spot for second-hand books and sad-eyed animals, had found a shivering bundle of golden fur tucked behind a dumpster near the back of the library, after hearing a faint whimper beneath the storm. And though the puppy was barely alive, its ribs visible, fur matted, and eyes too scared to cry, Thomas had wrapped him in his own jacket without hesitation, whispering words he himself hadn't heard in years. "You're safe now, little guy," and had taken him home, naming him Max after a character in one of the library's well-loved children's books, a protector, a loyal soul. And from that moment, the two were never apart, walking every morning through the fog-laced trails of Bellevue Park, reading together on the creaky couch by the fireplace, and even sharing silent dinners while old vinyl records played softly in the background. And while Thomas never married, never had children, and lived most of his life in the comfortable shadows of books and quiet corners, Max filled that space, growing from a frail puppy into a golden beacon of strength and joy, his presence turning the silence from loneliness into peace, his bark warding off the invisible ghosts that sometimes crept in at night. And as years turned their pages, Thomas grew older, his hair graying, back bending slightly, and Max aged too, his legs slower, eyes clouded with the soft haze of time. But their bond never wavered, not even when Thomas first coughed blood into the sink and hid it from Max with a forced smile, not even when the doctor's voice became serious and the hospital visits more frequent, and certainly not when hospice was suggested. The house sold, and room 306 became home, because Max refused to stay behind, refused to be separated. And though rules didn't allow dogs to remain overnight, hospice staff, touched by the way Max curled up beside the hospital bed and licked Thomas's trembling fingers, bent the rules, wheeling in a soft dog bed beside the patient's cot. But Max never used it, not once, choosing instead the cold linoleum floor where he could feel every heartbeat, hear every breath, and watch with unwavering devotion as the man who had once saved him now faded like an old photograph. And as the days passed and Thomas slipped further away, memories swirled around Max like scents carried by wind, chasing autumn leaves in the park, watching thunderstorms from the safety of the porch. The night Thomas cried alone after losing his mother, and Max pressed his muzzle to his chest. The quiet birthdays, the silly hats, the Christmas mornings filled with crinkled wrapping paper and laughter, and above all, the sense of being each other's only true companion in a world that often moved too fast and cared too little. And on the fourth day, when Thomas's breathing grew so faint it was hard to tell if he was still holding on, Max lifted his head, ears perked, sensing something the others couldn't, and gave a soft, almost mournful bark, one that made the nurse, Eliza, stop mid-step and look in, her eyes filling with tears at the sight of the old dog, nudging the man's hand gently, as if urging him not to go yet, as if pleading with life itself. And just then, Thomas stirred slightly, his lips parting to whisper one last breath. "Good boy," barely audible. But Max heard it like a trumpet blast, and laid his head down again, this time completely still, as Thomas's monitor beeped once, then ceased, the flat line echoing into a silence so profound even the flowers on the bedside table seemed to bow. And yet Max didn't move, didn't whimper or howl, just stayed there, eyes open, as if guarding the soul's departure. And what happened next was something no one in Willow Haven could forget. For after Thomas's passing, Max refused to leave the room for hours, even when the orderlies came in, even when the bed was stripped and the lights dimmed, and only when Eliza knelt down and spoke gently, "He's gone, sweet boy, he's gone," did Max stand slowly, legs trembling, and walk out on his own, tail low, head heavy, but with dignity, as though completing an ancient duty. And the hospice allowed him to remain on site, letting him sleep by the garden bench where Thomas used to sit and read aloud to him. And though Max grew thinner and weaker in the following weeks, he'd often be seen lying by the bench, eyes watching the wind as if still waiting for Thomas to return. And then one morning, just before sunrise, Max was found curled peacefully on the grass beneath a blooming dogwood tree, his body still, eyes closed, a gentle smile on his face, and in his mouth was clutched an old bookmark from the library, a small paper square that had somehow survived all these years, with faded ink that read, "No story ever truly ends. It just turns into something else." And the hospice staff buried him beside the garden, placing a small stone that read, "Max, a loyal friend until the end," and people came from across the county to pay respects, leaving flowers, dog treats, even handwritten notes. Because the story of Thomas and Max had become more than just a man and his dog. It had become a symbol of unwavering love, of unspoken promises kept until the last breath, and of how sometimes the most heartbreaking truths are also the most beautiful. For the reason Max refused to leave that room wasn't just grief. It was the unbearable thought of letting go of the one soul who had once pulled him from the shadows and showed him what love truly meant. And now their story lives on in the whispers of Willow Haven, in the wag of an old dog's tail, in the kindness of strangers, and in the echoes of room 306, where a bond so deep defied even death itself. But just as stories do not end with the closing of a book, the tale of Thomas and Max refused to fade with the last breath of either soul. Rather, it began to ripple outward, touching the lives of people who had never even met them, beginning with a young hospice janitor named Levi, who had only worked part-time at Willow Haven for a few weeks before Thomas passed, a quiet 17-year-old with unkempt curls and headphones always around his neck. The kind of kid most overlooked, yet something about room 306 had drawn him in from the start. Not just the smell of old books that clung to Thomas's possessions, or the scratch of Max's paws against the tile, but a warmth in the air that felt like coming home. And he found himself lingering outside the door during his shifts, watching from the hallway as Max rested his head beside Thomas's motionless fingers. And he couldn't explain it, but every time he walked past, something in him softened, cracked open, like a window long stuck shut, suddenly letting in light. And after Max's death, Levi began asking questions, shyly at first, then more urgently, speaking to Eliza, combing through the hospice records, even tracking down the local library where Thomas had worked all those years, until he found the worn employee photo of a younger, smiling man with a golden retriever puppy on his lap, and knew this was what had been missing in his life, not just the companionship, but the meaning behind it, the quiet grace of devotion without condition, the kind of love that didn't ask to be repaid. And Levi, who had grown up in a string of foster homes and bounced between temporary guardians, found himself returning to the garden bench each evening after his shift, sitting where Max once lay, feeling as though the air still held the weight of both souls. And it was there, under the dogwood tree, that he began writing in an old spiral notebook he found in the hospice lost and found box, scribbling poems, fragments of thoughts, stories, all about dogs, about grief, about healing. And before long, he posted one short piece online, not expecting anything, just needing to share it. And to his surprise, it was shared, then reshared, then published by a local blog that ran a story titled "The Dog Who Waited, Love That Outlives Us." And soon journalists began visiting Willow Haven, drawn by the legend of Max and Thomas. And while some came for headlines, Others came in tears, clutching old collars and photographs, each person carrying their own story of loss, of loyalty, of the silent bonds we form with those who can't speak, but understand us better than any human ever could. And the hospice, once a quiet and often forgotten place, found itself transformed into a sanctuary of sorts. Letters and tokens began appearing at the base of the dogwood tree. Children left drawings of golden retrievers with angel wings. Elderly couples came to sit by the bench and hold hands. Dog rescue organizations began visiting, offering companionship therapy with shelter pups for patients. And in time, a local sculptor named Henrietta, who had lost her husband and their dog Boomer in the same year, offered to donate a life-size statue of Max curled beside Thomas's slippers, based on the last photo Eliza had taken, an image that had gone viral for its haunting tenderness. And though the statue took nearly 6 months to complete, when it was unveiled on the anniversary of Thomas's death, people from across the state gathered in silent reverence, some laying down sunflowers, others kneeling to touch the bronze paw, whispering prayers or thanks. And while many wept, the atmosphere was not heavy with sorrow, but thick with love, the kind that never asks to be remembered, but somehow always is. And among the crowd, Levi stood quietly, no longer a janitor, but now studying veterinary medicine at the local college, holding a small rescue pup named Luna, who had been found trembling near the same alleyway Max had once known, and who now wore a red scarf Levi had knitted himself. And when asked why he had taken this path, Levi only smiled and said, "Because Max showed me what healing looks like." And stories began emerging from others too. An elderly widower named Mr. Dawson, who had stopped drinking after visiting the garden bench. A young woman named Kaylee, who adopted a senior dog with cataracts after reading about Max's loyalty. A man who drove 3 states just to walk the hospice path with his childhood dog's ashes in his coat pocket. And even the hospice board, once skeptical about allowing animals full access, rewrote their policies after a unanimous vote, launching the Max Companion program that matched dogs with terminal patients based on personality, music preference, even the books they liked. And soon, the halls of Willow Haven were filled with the gentle patter of paws, the soft thump of tails against bedside chairs, and the quiet sighs of people whose final moments became lighter, because someone had remembered what Thomas and Max had taught the world, that love, especially the wordless kind, is not just comfort in life, but a lighthouse in death, guiding us gently, unfailingly, to whatever lies beyond. And yet the story didn't end there, because one autumn evening, 5 years after the passing, a boy named Eli wandered into the garden during visiting hours, his face pale, his shoulders too small for the oversized hoodie he wore. And as he sat beneath the dogwood tree, clutching a photo of a brindle mutt named Daisy, who had passed 2 days prior, he began to cry, not loudly, but with the quiet despair of someone who thought elderly woman sat beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, and told him the story of Thomas and Max, pointing to the statue, sharing every detail like a bedtime tale passed down through generations. And by the time she finished, Eli's tears had softened into something else, something like awe. And he asked if it was true, if a dog could really stay until the very end. And the woman nodded, saying, "Not only that, sweetheart, some never leave at all." And she smiled, standing and walking away. And when Eli turned to thank her, she had vanished without a trace, leaving only a trail of dog paw prints in the dew-covered grass leading back to the statue. Though no dog had been seen that day, and while most dismissed the moment as poetic coincidence, others weren't so sure, because stories like this don't end, they echo, they evolve, they find new voices. And soon, a filmmaker contacted the hospice, proposing a documentary titled The Last Watch, The Dog Who Wouldn't Leave, which later premiered at film festivals and moved entire theaters to tears, sparking an influx of support for animal shelters, hospice centers, and end-of-life care programs. And in one breathtaking scene, Levi, now fully a vet, and running a dog grief support nonprofit, reads an excerpt from one of Thomas's old library journals, found hidden inside a donation box years after his passing, where he had written, "Max doesn't just follow me, he reminds me of who I am when I forget. And when I'm gone, I hope he reminds someone else." And he had, more than anyone could ever count. And perhaps the most profound reminder came not from humans, but from the dogs who began arriving at Willow, haven in dreams, in stories, in rescues that bore uncanny similarities to Max. One with the same soft brown spot over his left eye, another with a habit of tilting his head to the same Billie Holiday vinyl Thomas used to play. And while logic told people these were just coincidences, those who knew the truth, who felt the warmth of a silent room suddenly stirred by presence, knew better. For love like theirs does not vanish. It transforms, moving like wind through open windows, like sunlight across a worn garden bench, like the gentle pressure of a head resting beside your hand when you need it most. And now, every year on the anniversary of Thomas's passing, Willow Haven holds a candlelight vigil in the garden where people bring photos of their beloved pets, whisper their names, and sit under the stars as music drifts from hidden speakers and dogs curl at their feet. And if you sit quietly enough, they say you might hear the faint jingle of a collar, the soft thud of a golden tail wagging in contentment, or even feel the brush of fur against your ankle. And when you look around, nothing will be there, at least not something you can see. But your heart will know, in that way hearts always know, that Thomas and Max are still watching, still guiding, still loving. And their story lives not only in marble and memory, but in every act of kindness sparked by their bond, every rescue that found a home, every lonely soul who, for even one moment, felt seen and loved, because of a tale that began in a rainy alley and ended in eternity. And maybe, just maybe, that's all any of us ever hope for, that when our time comes, someone will stay, someone will remember, and someone will carry our story forward, the way Max carried Thomas's love until the end. And then beyond it, into the hearts of countless strangers, into the trembling paws of new beginnings, into the moonlit muzzle of a dog who once waited by a bed and never truly left. As the years passed, the story of Max and Thomas evolved into something larger than anyone could have imagined, a living testament to the power of love, devotion, and the quiet understanding between humans and dogs that transcends time. It became more than just a local legend. It became a symbol of everything people hoped for in their darkest moments. And even though it was said that love like theirs never truly ends, there came a day when the echoes of their story started to fade in the wind, as all stories do. But those who had been touched by it would never forget. They could never forget. Levi, now a young man of 23, had found his place in the world. He had become a renowned veterinarian and animal grief counselor, traveling across the country to help others who had lost their beloved pets. His nonprofit organization, Max's Circle, provided support to families who had experienced the death of their pets, offering not just counseling, but the emotional tools to cope with the kind of love that felt too immense to be contained in a single lifetime. It was a mission birthed from his own grief, nurtured by the memories of Thomas and Max, and fueled by his belief that the bond between animals and humans was a spiritual one, that no matter how much time passed, love endured forever. But as he stood in the sanctuary that had once been Willow Haven, now a larger hospice center with sprawling gardens and therapy animals of all kinds, Levi felt the weight of an unspoken truth. It was the anniversary of Thomas's passing, and the candlelight vigil was about to begin. The garden had filled with families, caregivers, and volunteers, all gathered in remembrance. The tree where Max had once lain at Thomas's side stood as a sentinel in the center, surrounded by hundreds of glowing candles. The statue of Max, forever frozen in time beside his friend, gleamed under the soft light of the evening, a lasting tribute to their unshakable bond. Yet, even with the stillness of the night, Levi couldn't shake the sense that something was missing. In all the years since Max's death, he had never quite been able to shake the feeling that there was one final piece to their story, something that had always been just beyond his reach. And as the crowd gathered, the air thick with both sorrow and serenity, Levi couldn't help but notice something that sent a chill down his spine. The statue of Max, though lifelike in every detail, wasn't the only presence in the garden. There, standing at the far edge of the circle of candles, was a figure that felt familiar, yet impossible. A golden retriever, not the statue, but the same breed, with a familiar glint in his eyes. His fur was still as golden as the sun that had once set on Thomas's life, and his presence was both serene and somehow radiant, like the dog had been a part of the place for far longer than anyone could fathom. Levi stood frozen, staring, uncertain whether he was imagining it, until the dog moved. Not swiftly, but in a way that carried the heavy grace of someone who had learned how to walk with a soul so full of love it could leave an imprint on the very earth itself. The dog approached the center of the garden, passing between the candles, and for a moment, Levi's breath caught in his chest. The air seemed to hum with an unspoken understanding, a reminder of something greater than the ordinary world. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the dog stopped in front of the statue of Max, sitting down as though in silent reverence. His gaze, steady and soulful, met Levi's. Levi didn't move. He couldn't. For a long moment, the two simply stood there, Levi, frozen, and the dog, watching him with an intensity that spoke of memories, of shared lives, and of the unbreakable bonds between a person and the creatures who love them beyond reason. And then, as if recognizing the weight of the moment, the dog turned away, trotting toward the bench beneath the dogwood tree where Max and Thomas had shared their final moments. Levi watched as the dog paused there, as if offering his own silent blessing to the garden, to the spirits of those who had come before, and to the idea that love, in whatever form it takes, will always find its way back to where it is most needed. As the night wore on, the vigil continued, and the sky darkened, filled with stars and memories. Levi's eyes never left the dog, and eventually, when the candles had all burned low and the crowd had started to thin, Levi approached the bench where the golden retriever had sat. But when he arrived, the dog was gone, as though he had never been there at all, leaving nothing behind except the scent of pine and earth and the faintest trace of paw prints on the damp grass. It was then, in the quiet aftermath, that Levi understood. The final piece of the story had always been there, in the small, unspoken moments of connection. Thomas had left, yes, but Max hadn't truly gone. Max had never left. He had lived on, in the lives of those who knew what it meant to be loved so deeply, so purely, that even death couldn't sever the bond. And in his absence, in the silent watch he had kept over Thomas, Max had left behind a legacy that would outlive them both. Because the truth was that love was never bound by time or space. It transcended the boundaries of life and death, and it lived on forever. Years later, the garden where Max and Thomas had once shared their final moments would become a place of pilgrimage for many, a place where the hearts of those who had lost their companions could find solace. The story would spread, reaching new hearts, new generations, as people came to understand that love is not something that fades, but something that grows. The dog, the man, the bond, these were not just characters in a story. They were a part of the world's most universal truth. Love, pure and unyielding, is a force that outlasts outlasts even the most painful of goodbyes. And in that truth, in that quiet, never-ending love, Thomas and Max would always be remembered not as a tragic pair, but as a reminder of the beauty of life itself, of the ways in which love teaches us to be better, to be kinder, to be more than we ever thought possible. As for Levi, he continued his work, his heart forever carrying the lessons of Max and Thomas with him. He named his first dog after them, a spirited golden retriever who had a habit of waiting patiently by the door until Levi returned home. And sometimes, when the stars shone brightly above and the air held a certain stillness, he could swear he could hear the soft patter of paws beside him and feel a presence, warm and loving, just behind him, always with him. For in the end, stories like theirs, stories of love, of loyalty, of companionship, are never truly over. They live on, woven into the very fabric of life, and passed down from one heart to the next, until they become a part of us all. The legacy of Max and Thomas, of a man, his dog, and the bond that neither death nor time could sever remained, immortalized in the quiet moments of peace shared between humans and animals alike. And whenever someone asked Levi about the truth behind the legend of Max and Thomas, he would smile softly, looking up at the stars, and say, "Love is never lost. It only changes shape, and if we are lucky, we get to carry it with us." And that, in the end, was the greatest gift of all.